A reading of Erasing History by Jason Stanley. Preface. The Soviet system never commemorated the Holocaust. One reason for this is that once you define and identify one genocide, you can recognize other genocidal crimes. The Soviet Empire didn't want us to learn our history. Quote from Victoria Emelina, "Nothing bad has ever happened." One lesson the past century has taught us is authoritarian regimes often find history profoundly threatening. At every opportunity, these regimes find ways of erasing or concealing history in order to consolidate their power. Why is this? What does history do that is so disruptive of authoritarian goals? Perhaps most importantly, it provides multiple perspectives on the past. Authoritarianism's great rival democracy requires the recognition of a shared reality that consists of multiple perspectives. Through exposure to multiple perspectives, citizens learn to regard one another as equal contributors to a national narrative. And we learn to accept that this narrative is open to continued collective reflection and reimagination. Constantly taking into account new ideas, new evidence, new perspectives, and theoretical framings. History in a democracy is not static, not mythic, but dynamic and critical. Erasing history helps authoritarians because doing so allows them to misrepresent it as a single story, a single perspective, but it is impossible to erase a perspective entirely. When authoritarians attempt to erase history, they do so through education, by purging certain narratives from the curricula taught in schools, and perhaps by forbidding their telling at home. However, authoritarians cannot erase people's lived experiences and their legacies written into the bones of generations. In this simple fact lies always the possibility of reclaiming lost perspectives. All of this is true of authoritarianism generally, but it is especially true of one specific kind of authoritarian ideology, fascism, which seeks to divide populations into us and them by appealing to ethnic, racial, or religious differences. In my previous book, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, I identified a set of tactics that characterize fascist politics, which include the creation of a mythic past, the use of propaganda and anti-intellectualism to create a state of unreality, an effort to justify hierarchies of race or religion, the exploitation of feelings of resentment and victimhood, policies that prioritize law and order over freedom, appeals to sexual anxiety, an evocation of the myth of Sodom and Gomorrah, which holds that cities are decadent and crime-ridden, and that rural areas are the heartland of a nation. And finally, a value system that ranks groups according to their supposed capacity to work, encapsulated by the slogan the Nazis hypocritically used, "Arbeit macht frei," or "Work shall make you free." The rise of contemporary fascism poses a grave threat and makes urgent the task of understanding its workings. Truly understanding fascism's success, however, requires discerning not just how it operates and seizes power, but also how it achieves legitimacy. We must therefore turn the lens from fascist politics to the kind of education and culture that makes such a politics effective. This is where the topic of erasing history looms large. In recent years, a debate has broken out amongst scholars and pundits about whether the term fascism appropriately describes the ascendant right-wing authoritarian movements we are seeing around the world. We can largely bypass this debate here. Whether we call them fascist or not, there is widespread agreement that the social and political movements we are witnessing today employ many of the same political tactics and rhetorical techniques that past fascist movements have. Conjuring violent vigilante mobs who threaten people who oppose them, stacking courts with loyalists to a leader or a party, directing hatred against immigrants and LGBTQ citizens, dismantling reproductive rights and using education to indoctrinate the young in a narrative of national greatness rooted in a glorious past. While some may disagree with my decision to call these movements fascist, including some who share my assessment of the danger they pose, I find the label apt, and will continue to use it in these pages when referring to those who engage in clearly fascist politics with the aim of attacking democracy. Because these anti-democratic movements are ascendant throughout the world, my scope here is international and will cover at various points fascist authoritarian cultures in countries such as Russia, India, Turkey, Israel, and Hungary. However, with that said, I live in the United States, and my country will serve as the central example. Here, as elsewhere, an ideological war has been taking place in recent years that extends into nearly every aspect of our culture. The fight dips into our neighborhoods, our courts, and our bedrooms, but ultimately, as I will show, finds its deepest expression in one of our most egalitarian public institutions, our schools. The sides in this war have largely been shaped by two opposing perspectives: those who wish to preserve hierarchies rooted in arbitrary factors like race, ethnicity, and gender, and those who wish to upend them. My grandmother, Ilse Stanley, born in 1906, was raised in Berlin in the shadow of the Fascists synagogue, one of the largest congregations in Germany at the time, where her father, Magnus David Schoen, was the chief cantor. The synagogue practiced the German Jewish liberal tradition. Like a church, it had an organ. Its music was proudly in the classical tradition. My grandmother was the archetype of the assimilated German Jew, and as she saw it, German culture, the culture of Goethe and Heine, was her own. It was a beacon of enlightenment and humanism. Before becoming a cantor, Magnus David Schoen was an opera singer. He is mentioned in a biography of the composer and conductor Gustav Mahler, which quotes from a conversation between the two about their shared Jewish heritage and my great-grandfather's decision to leave the opera for the synagogue. At the time of the conversation, he was singing the central part in an 1899 production of Richard Wagner's Lohengrin that Mahler was conducting. His brother Max would later sing in the same opera as part of the Bayreuth Festival in 1908. Ilse, descended from this family of Wagner singers, became an actress and trained with the great Berlin theater director Max Reinhardt. She also acted for director Fritz Lang in his groundbreaking 1972 film Metropolis. She lived in one of the great intellectual and cultural capitals of the world, home to a renowned university, which hosted such luminaries as W.E.B. Du Bois, Albert Einstein, Max Planck, Erwin Schrödinger, and Max Weber. Yet just a few years later, my German Jewish family in Berlin would be ejected from this cosmopolitan paradise. How could this be? How could it come to pass that my grandmother, whose talents had earned her a place of prominence within the German culture, would be banned from the theater, her artistry deemed dangerous and alien? When the Nazis came to power in Germany, they placed at the ideological center of their political movement a fictional view of the country and its people, a land inhabited by a pure race of Aryans, which had been infiltrated by Jewish foreigners who were seeking to undermine German institutions and topple the dominance of the German race. At the heart of fascist ideology broadly, the Nazi ideology specifically, is this conspiracy about the replacement of a dominant group. The Nazis enacted laws that stripped German Jews of citizenship, casting them as a dangerous internal enemy, and took them as their target, the very cosmopolitanism that my grandmother exemplified. Her identification with German culture did little to protect her because it contradicted the Nazi narrative in which her role was predetermined and unchangeable. Her assimilation was not what the Nazis wanted, but precisely what they were trying to prevent. As the Nazis saw it, Germany's greatness was based not on its broad humanism and commitments to experimentation and intellectual innovation, but on its Aryan character. Germany in the 1920s had some of the best universities in the world. Many of the world's leading intellectuals, and was the leading edge of modernity. For that reason, a study of the fascist sacking of Germany and the ideology's successful mutation of the nation's self-conception has much to tell us about the rising threats we face today. The nation's self-understanding of its history and identity, preserved through its schools and its culture, was proven to be far less protective than many believe. It would be wise to avoid the same misapprehension. For some, the United States' ethos of openness and freedom may seem incompatible with fascism's project of erasing history until it is reduced to a single perspective. But this impulse to eliminate historical narratives can have many different motivations, some of which may be more palatable than others. Consider the era of the Red Scare in the United States during the late 1940s and 50s, often referred to as the McCarthy era, after the red hunting senator from Wisconsin. This was a time when leftists in higher education, the arts, and other fields were publicly humiliated, denounced by Congress, and fired from their jobs in a sensational fashion. The campaign of censorship and intimidation, led by the House Un-American Activities Committee, was principally concerned with hunting down communist socialists and anyone who might harbor sympathy for the country's adversary in the Cold War, the Soviet Union. In this instance, the HUAC's effort to erase leftist perspectives from the academy and elsewhere was motivated, at least in some part, by opposition to the Soviet Union's authoritarianism, which, of course, in no way excuses its destructive overreaches. The Red Scare of the 1940s and 50s was a betrayal of the very ideals of freedom that the United States purported to represent in the Cold War. However, the episode does at least partly explain how and why the fascist project of erasing history can take root in a distinctly American context. Today, we are unquestionably returning to something like the era of the Red Scare. Right-wing activists and politicians are targeting educators at all levels for their supposedly leftist ideologies, with the goal of suppressing any teaching that challenges racial hierarchy or patriarchy. But this assault on history goes far beyond local school boards, state departments of education, or even national elections. It is in fact a transnational movement with a deep historical precedent and is symptomatic of a larger global attack on liberal democracy. A liberal democracy is a system that centers the values of freedom and equality, in which all citizens have equal political value, and are thus entitled to equal respect and dignity. With that freedom comes responsibility, including the responsibility to safeguard and improve the institution of democracy. Progressive educational movements within liberal democracies have long served to draw out this sense of responsibility in young people. Education, however, does not always serve this purpose. It can also be wielded against democracy in service of hierarchy. And this is precisely where so many of the recent battles over education have been waged. In a liberal democracy, there will always be, and always should be, debates between different visions of how education should work, over questions such as the proper balance between the pursuit of secular ideals and the preservation of shared traditions, or whether to place greater emphasis on liberal or vocational education. But education can also support an anti-democratic agenda. In the cases of Russia and North Korea today, we can see how the education system helps to cultivate an unhealthy reverence for leaders, placing them above the rule of law. In other countries, such as India, the education system is used to place Hindu Indians over Muslim Indians. In each case, the education functions to undermine the basic democratic equal citizenship. To be clear, hierarchies are not inherently oppressive. In medical school, for example, an attending physician stands in hierarchy over medical students. This is an example of epistemological hierarchy, one based on knowledge. Knowledge can certainly be employed to mass subjugation and control. A doctor can be directed to diagnose an anti-colonial rebel or political protester as mentally unstable, but ideally at least, the epistemological hierarchies guide rather than dominate. A hierarchy of value is different, serving to place one group of people above another or one individual over all others. It is typically used to justify the domination of certain groups or individuals. Hierarchies of value violate the fundamental ideals of liberal democracy, and, indeed, cannot tolerate the equal moral and political status of all people. Because this is a book about fascist culture, it is worth saying a bit more about what exactly cultures are and how they work. Taking up the proposition of Swiss philosopher Rahel Yegi, we can think of a culture as a form of life, a coordinated web of practices, orientations, and myths. Cultures of hierarchy, such as colonialism, nationalism, or fascism, involve practices that place one group above others, and as is the case with all other cultures or forms of life, these practices are in large part shaped by and reinforced by schools. Every education system involves erasure One cannot simply teach everything. There are, however, certain kinds of erasures that are constructive of authoritarian systems. For example, erasures of social movements for democracy, such as the Chinese government's erasure of Tiananmen Square protest and massacre of 1989, or the state of Florida's erasure of the 2020 Black Lives Matter uprising from social studies curriculum. By removing the history of uprisings against the current status quo from the curriculum, or never allowing that history to be taught in the first place, authoritarians leave students with the impression that the status quo has never been and cannot be challenged. And that's the end of the first part.